Welcome to the London Gritty Chronicles. Imagine a world where you could walk from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea without fear. A world where a single golden tablet, a piece of metal no bigger than your hand, guarantees your safety. Across thousands of miles of wilderness. It sounds like a dream of modern globalization, but this was the reality of the 13th century. It was a time of unprecedented connection. Spices, silk, gunpowder, and ideas flowed like water across the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But this perfect highway had a flaw. It was too efficient. It was too fast. The same smooth roads that carried silk to Italy also carried something else, something invisible, something that would eventually kill nearly half the population of the known world. This is the story of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, and it is the story of how the greatest achievement in political stability became the greatest vulnerability for human biology. We often think of history as a list of battles, but today we are looking at the spaces between the battles. We are looking at trade, travel, and the unintended consequences of connection. Welcome to Part 1. Let's step onto the Silk Road. To understand the end of the world, we must first understand the system that built it. We begin on the high steppes of Central Asia. The year is roughly 1250. The air here is thin and cold. If you stand on a ridge, you see nothing but grass stretching to the horizon. It looks empty, but it is not. For centuries, this land was a chaotic puzzle of warring tribes. Travel here was impossible. If you were a merchant trying to cross from China to Persia, you would be stopped. A dozen times. You would be taxed by one warlord, robbed by another, and likely killed by a third. The distance between east and west was not measured in miles, but in risk. Then, one man changed the calculus. Temujin, who the world would come to know as Genghis Khan, did the impossible. He unified the tribes. Through brutal warfare and brilliant strategy, he forged a single political entity. English learners, listen to that phrase, political entity. This means a group of people or lands that act as one single unit, under one government. By the time of his successors, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Korean peninsula in the east all the way to Hungary in the west. It was massive. But the Mongols were not just conquerors, they were administrators. An administrator is someone who manages or organizes a system. The Mongols realized that a dead peasant pays no taxes, a robbed merchant brings no wealth. So, they imposed a strict, terrifying order. They stopped the petty wars. They crushed the local bandits. They created a zone of stability so secure that a historian later wrote that a virgin carrying a sack of gold could ride unharmed from one end of the empire to the other. This period is called the Pax Mongolica. Let's break that term down. Pax is the Latin word for peace. You might know it from the term Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Historians use it to describe a long period where a dominant power forces stability on a region. Mongolica simply refers to the Mongols. So the Pax Mongolica was the Mongol peace. But do not misunderstand the word peace. This was not a gentle peace. It was a peace enforced by the sword. If you broke the law, the punishment was swift and usually fatal. But for a merchant, this peace was a golden age. Suddenly, the Silk Road, which had been dangerous and fragmented, became a superhighway. The Mongols built the Yam. The Yam was a postal system, but it was much more than that. It was the internet of the Middle Ages. Every 20 or 30 miles, there was a station. At these stations, there were fresh horses, food, and shelter. Official riders could gallop at full speed to a station, swap their tired horse for a fresh one, and keep riding. They could cover 200 or 300 miles in a single day. News that used to take months now took weeks. This infrastructure is critical to our story. Infrastructure refers to the physical structures needed for a society to function, like roads, bridges, and in this case, supply stations. The Mongols connected the world's nervous system. Now, imagine you are a traveler in this system. You are an Italian merchant, perhaps from Venice. You have a special passport. It is called a paisa. A paisa was a tablet made of gold, silver, or wood, depending on your rank. It had writing on it, usually issuing a command from the Khan himself. It said, essentially, by the power of eternal heaven, anyone who does not respect the bearer of this tablet, the bearer of this tablet shall die. If you held a paisa, you could demand horses. You could demand food. You were protected by the most feared army on earth. This political stability caused an explosion in trade. This is where English learners should focus on the concept of exchange. Exchange means the act of giving one thing and receiving another. Merchants exchanged furs from the north for spices from the south. They exchanged silver for silk. But they also exchanged invisible things. They exchanged stories. They exchanged religions. Missionaries traveled east. Monks traveled west. And without knowing it, they exchanged biology. Here is the twist. Here is the tragic irony of the Pax Mongolica. Human beings thrive on connection. We build roads to bring us closer together. We build ships to trade with distant neighbors. We crave connection because it brings wealth and knowledge. But nature has a different rule. In nature, isolation is a form of safety. When populations are separated by mountains or dangerous deserts, diseases stay local. A virus might wipe out one village, but it cannot cross the desert to the next one. The fire burns out because it runs out of fuel. The Mongols removed the fire breaks. By making the world safe for travel, they made the world safe for the transmission of disease. Transmission is a key word for this series. It means the action of passing something from one place or person to another. We transmit radio signals, we transmit money, and we transmit viruses. The YAM system, with its fast horses and regular stops, was designed to move information quickly. But it was also the perfect mechanism for moving a pathogen. A pathogen is a bacterium, virus, or other microorganism that can cause disease. In the mid-14th century, the climate began to change. The steppes became wetter, or the rodent populations, marmots and ground squirrels, began to fluctuate, and deep within those rodent burrows, an ancient bacterium was waking up. Its scientific name is Yersinia pestis. At this moment in our story, around the 1330s, the road is open. The paisa is gleaming in the sunlight. The horses are fresh. The merchants are counting their profits, dreaming of the wealth they will bring back to Europe. They do not see the flea hiding in the fur shipment. They do not hear the coughing of the marmots on the steppe. They are celebrating the Pax Mongolica. They are celebrating the unity of the world. They do not realize that they have built the perfect engine for their own destruction. The door is open. The guard is asleep. And something is coming down the road. In part 2, we will look at the biology of the killer. We will zoom in from the vast empire to the microscopic stomach of a flea. We will understand exactly how this bacterium works and why the Mongol supply lines were the fuel it was waiting for. Now, we must look at the micro view. To understand this tragedy, we have to look through a microscope. We are zooming in on a creature smaller than a grain of rice, the flea, specifically the rat flea. In the vast grasslands of Central Asia, these fleas usually lived on wild rodents called marmots. It was a local problem. If a hunter skinned a sick marmot, he might die, but the disease stopped there. This is what scientists call an animal reservoir. A reservoir is usually a place where water is stored, but in biology, a reservoir is a population of animals where a disease lives naturally. The bacteria lived in the reservoir. The humans lived in their villages. The two worlds were separate. But the Pax Mongolica changed the environment. As the Mongol trade routes expanded, they needed food. You cannot feed an army or a network of postal stations on grass alone. You need grain. You need millet. You need wheat. Huge caravans of grain began to move across the steppes, and wherever grain goes, rats follow. The rats moved out of the wild and into the supply wagons. They climbed into the sacks of feed. They nestled into the bundles of silk, and they brought their fleas with them. Here is the terrifying biological mechanism that powered the plague. When a flea drinks the blood of an infected animal, it swallows the bacteria. Inside the flea's stomach, the bacteria multiply rapidly. They grow into a thick, solid mass. Eventually, this mass completely blocks the flea's gut. The flea begins to starve. It is hungry, so it jumps onto a new host, a rat or a human, and tries to drink blood, but it cannot swallow. The blockage stops the food. Frustrated and starving, the flea bites again and again. In the process, it vomits the bacteria back into the open wound. English learners, the word here is regurgitate. It means to bring swallowed food back up to the mouth. The starving flea becomes a biological syringe. It is a machine designed to spread infection. Now connect this biology to the Mongol infrastructure. Remember the yam stations? Those rest stops spaced every 20 or 30 miles. For a human, these were places of comfort. For a rat, they were paradise. Each station had grain storage. Each station had warm stables. The rats could hop from a wagon to a stable, mix with local rats, and then hop onto the next wagon heading west. The disease was no longer walking, it was hitchhiking. There is a concept in epidemiology called the incubation period. Incubation is the time between catching a disease and showing the first symptoms. For the plague, this period is usually 2 to 6 days. In the Old World, before the Mongols, travel was slow. If a merchant got sick, he would die on the road long before. He reached the next city. The disease would burn out in the wilderness. But the Mongol riders were fast. The trade caravans were efficient. A merchant could travel further in 6 days than ever before. He could arrive at a crowded market, check into an inn, and share a meal. Before he realized he was sick, the efficiency of the empire defeated the safety of distance. By the 1340s, the bacteria had left the wild steppes. It was moving along the Silk Road. It passed through the great caravan cities of Central Asia. It was heading toward the Black Sea. It was heading toward the edge of Europe. The locals in these trading cities began to notice something strange. It wasn't the humans getting sick first. It was the animals. They saw rats staggering in the streets. They saw cats dying. This brings us to a useful English phrase, the canary in the coal mine. Miners used to carry birds into tunnels. If the bird died, it meant the air was poisonous, and the men had to run. The dying rats were the canary in the coal mine. But no one knew how to read the signal. They didn't understand that the death of the rats meant the fleas were looking for a new host, and the nearest host was us. The trap is set. The biology has exploited the infrastructure. The bacteria is riding the superhighway of the Pax Mongolica. Next, the road ends at a port city, a city under siege, a city where history is about to witness one of the first recorded acts of biological warfare. In part 3, we travel to the city of Caffa. The walls are high, the enemy is outside, and death is about to fly over the wall. We are standing on the edge of the Black Sea. The year is 1346. We are in the city of Caffa. Today, this city is called Feodosia, in Crimea. But in the 14th century, Caffa was a slice of Italy transplanted onto the edge of the Mongol Empire. It was a trading colony owned by the Republic of Genoa. And imagine a city trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea. Behind the city walls lay the vast ocean. This was the Genoese escape route. In front of the walls sat the Golden Horde, the Western army of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols, led by a warlord named Johnny Beg, had laid a siege to the city. English learners, this is a crucial military word. Siege. A siege happens when an army surrounds a city, cutting off all supplies, aiming to starve the people inside until they surrender. For months, the people of Caffa looked over their walls and saw the campfires of the Mongol army. They heard the drums. They smelled the smoke. They were terrified. They knew that if the Mongols broke through, every citizen would be killed or sold into slavery. But then, the rhythm of the siege changed. The Mongol attacks stopped, and the shouting died down. A strange silence fell over the enemy camp. The Genoese defenders peered over the stone walls. They didn't see soldiers charging. They saw soldiers stumbling. They saw piles of bodies growing larger every day. The invisible killer we discussed in part 2 had arrived at the Mongol camp. The plague was tearing through Johnny Beg's army. The Mongols were dying by the thousands. They were too sick to fight. The siege was failing. In a normal war, this would be a miracle for the city inside. The enemy is dying. We are saved. But Johnny Beg was not ready to retreat with dignity. He was angry. And in his anger, he reportedly ordered one of the most horrific acts in military history, according to an Italian notary named Gabriele de Musi, who wrote about this event. The Khan ordered his men to load their catapults. Usually, a catapult throws heavy stones to break walls, but Johnny Beg ordered them to load the rotting, infected corpses of his own dead soldiers. Snap, thud, bodies flew over the walls of Caffa. Snap, thud. Death rained down from the sky. The people of Caffa panicked. They tried to throw the bodies into the sea, but there were too many. The air became foul. The water became tainted. Historians debate this story. Some say the flying bodies account is an exaggeration. They argue that the rats simply crawled through cracks in the wall. Rats, after all, do not respect city borders. But whether it was a flying corpse or a creeping rat, the result was the same. The biological barrier was breached. The city of Caffa became a plague zone. Here, we see the concept of a vector. In medicine, a vector is an organism that transmits a disease or parasite from one animal or plant to another. The flea is the vector. The rat is the transport. The Genoese merchants realized the city was doomed. They did what sailors do. They ran to their ships. This moment, the loading of these ships, is the turning point of the Middle Ages. Picture the scene. It is chaotic. People are screaming, carrying heavy chests of gold and silk, fighting to get on board. They are fleeing the Mongols. They are fleeing the smell of death. They raise the sails. The wind catches the canvas. The galleys slip out of the harbor, heading southwest toward the narrow straits that lead to the Mediterranean. They believe they have escaped. They look back at the receding coastline of Crimea and breathe a sigh of relief. And we survived, they think. We are going home to Italy. But they are wrong. They are not alone on the ship. Down in the dark, damp hold of the vessel, hiding among the grain sacks and the bundles of fur, are the rats. And on the rats are the fleas. And in the blood of the sailors, the bacteria is already incubating. These ships are no longer just trading vessels. They are floating biological bombs, and they are headed straight for the heart of Europe. This brings us to a useful phrase, the Trojan horse. In Greek mythology, soldiers hid inside a wooden horse to enter a city. These Genoese ships were the Trojan horse of the 14th century. They looked like salvation, but they carried destruction. The Pax Mongolica made the trade possible. The siege of Caffa made the infection concentrated. And now, the maritime technology of Italy would make the spread global. The ships are sailing toward Sicily. The unsuspecting people of Messina are going about their day, watching the horizon, waiting for news from the east. They are about to get more news than they can handle. In part 4, the ships arrive. We will see what happens when a globalized disease hits a localized population. We will watch the first European port fall silent. But death is a patient stowaway. We are now in Messina, a bustling port city on the island of Sicily. The date is October 1347. The sun is shining on the water. The locals are gathering at the harbor. A harbor is a sheltered area of water where ships can dock safely. It is usually a place of welcome. When a ship arrives, it means business, news, and money. The dockworkers cheer as they see the Genoese galleys approaching. They have been waiting for these ships. They want the silk. They want the spices. They throw the heavy ropes to the sailors. They lower the wooden ramp, called the gangplank. But then, the cheering stops. The sailors do not walk down the ramp. They crawl. The people of Messina freeze. The men on the ships are not the strong, healthy sailors who left months ago. They are skeletons. Their skin is dark and blotchy. They are coughing up blood, and on their bodies, in the armpits and groins, are strange black swellings. These swellings are called buboes. They are the size of eggs, sometimes apples. They are hard, painful, and filled with infection. The friar Michael of Piazza, who witnessed this event, wrote a chilling account. He said the sailors carried a sickness clinging to their very bones. Panic explodes on the docks. The Messinians realize that this is not just a sickness, it is a curse. They try to help, but the moment they touch the sailors, the contract is signed. The fleas jump. When something is contagious, it spreads easily from one person to another by contact. A yawn is contagious. Laughter is contagious. But this death was highly contagious. Within days, the people of Messina began to die. The city officials realized their mistake. They ordered the Genoese ships to leave the harbor immediately. "Get out!" they screamed. "Take your death with you." The ships raised their anchors and sailed away. But it was too late. You cannot deport a biological event. The rats had already scrambled down the ropes. The fleas were already biting the local dogs and cats. The invisible army had established a beachhead. Messina was the beachhead for the invasion of Europe. The speed of the collapse was terrifying. This brings us to the concept of exponential growth. If one person infects 2, and those 2 infect 4, and those 4 infect 8, but very quickly they become massive. In Messina, society began to break down instantly. Parents abandoned their sick children. Husbands abandoned their wives. The fear of infection was stronger than the bonds of love. Michael of Piazza wrote, "One man shunned another. The father did not visit his son, nor the son his father." This is the accidental twist of the Pax Mongolica. The Mongols created a world of connection. The plague created a world of total isolation. The Genoese ships, rejected from Messina, sailed on. They were desperate. They needed water. They needed food. So they sailed to other ports. They went to Genoa. They went to Marseille in France. Everywhere they docked, they repeated the cycle: arrival, transmission, panic, expulsion, death. By the time the ports realized what was happening, the disease was already moving inland. It was traveling along the rivers. It was traveling along the roads. It was moving toward the heart of the European economy. The ships have done their job. Now the land must pay the price. But gates cannot stop the wind. They cannot stop the rats. And they certainly cannot stop the fleas hiding in the woolen cloth. We are now moving inland. We are leaving the coast and traveling deep into the heart of Europe. The year is 1348. The disease is no longer a rumor. It is a reality. It is traveling up the Rhone River in France. It is traveling along the trade routes of Italy. It is following the very same paths that the Pax Mongolica had made so profitable. The silk that was carried across the Asian steppes is now being sold in the markets of Florence and Paris. But the price is no longer gold. The price is life. Let's look at a specific English word pair: urban and rural. Urban refers to cities and towns, places with high population density. Rural refers to the countryside, places with farms and open space. Usually, diseases strike urban areas hard because people live close together. But in rural areas, people are safer. They are spread out. The Great Mortality, as they called it then, broke this rule. Because the trade networks were so efficient, the plague reached even the smallest villages. A merchant would flee the city to his country estate, thinking he was safe. But he brought his clothes, he brought his servants, and he brought the infection. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed this horror in Florence. He wrote a famous book called The Decameron. In it, he described a terrifying reality. The victims ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors in paradise. Lunch with friends, dinner with ancestors. That is how fast it killed. You could wake up healthy, feel a fever at noon, and be dead by sunset. The medical doctors of the time were helpless. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about fleas. They believed in miasma. Miasma is an old medical theory. It means bad air or poisonous vapor. Doctors believed the air itself was rotting. Imagine the Pope in the city of Avignon. He was one of the most powerful men in the world. He was terrified. To protect himself from the miasma, he sat in a room between 2 huge, roaring fires. He sat there for weeks, sweating in the heat, believing the fire would purify the air. Ironically, this might have actually worked, not because it cleaned the air, but because the heat kept the fleas away. Fleas do not like fire, but outside the Pope's palace, the world was collapsing. This brings us to the concept of social breakdown. A society relies on rules. We bury the dead. We care for the sick. We listen to the law. But when the mortality rate, the percentage of people who die, hits 50% or 60%, the rules vanish. In many towns, there were not enough living people to bury the dead. The graveyards were full, and they dug huge trenches and threw the bodies in, layer upon layer, like goods in a ship's hold. Boccaccio wrote that no more respect was shown to the dead than to dead goats. The church bells, which usually rang for every funeral, fell silent. There were too many deaths to ring for. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. And here is the biology mirroring the society again. Just as the body's immune system attacks itself when it panics, causing high fevers and swelling, the society began to attack itself. People were looking for someone to blame. They couldn't see the bacteria, so they looked for a human enemy. They blamed the Jews. They blamed foreigners. They blamed travelers. Horrific violence broke out. In many cities, innocent communities were massacred because fearful mobs believed they had poisoned the wells. This is a dark chapter of history known as scapegoating. A scapegoat is a person or group who is unfairly blamed for the problems of others. When people are terrified, they often look for a scapegoat rather than a solution. The Pax Mongolica had connected the world to share wealth. Now the world was sharing only fear. The trade routes were empty. The fields were overgrown. The crops were rotting because there were no peasants left to harvest them. The system had completely crashed. But in this crash, something unexpected was about to happen. The sheer scale of the death was about to force a change. The value of a human being was about to change. For the survivors, the end of the world was actually the beginning of a new opportunity. The peasants are about to realize their own worth. Now the screaming has stopped. The fires have burned down. The survivors are walking out of their homes. They look around. The world is quiet. It is empty. Roughly half of the population of Europe is dead. In some places, like Tuscany, it is 60%. In others, whole villages are gone. But for the living, a strange new reality is beginning. We are now looking at the economy. Specifically, we are looking at a fundamental rule of economics: supply and demand. Supply is how much of something you have. Demand is how much people want it. Before the plague, Europe was full of people. There was a high supply of workers. If you were a peasant, you had no power. If you demanded higher pay, the Lord would simply say no. There are 10 other men waiting to take your job. Labor was cheap. Life was hard. The system was called feudalism. Feudalism was a social system where peasants worked on a lord's land in exchange for protection, but they had very few rights and almost no money. But in 1350, the math changed instantly. The supply of workers had crashed. Imagine a wealthy landowner. His fields are full of ripe wheat. It needs to be harvested now. If it is not harvested, it will rot, and he will lose his fortune. He goes to the village to find workers, but there are only 3 men left alive. He orders them to work. In the old days, they would have bowed and obeyed, but now they look at the rotting field. They look at the desperate Lord, and they realize something powerful. They have leverage. Leverage is the power to influence a situation to get what you want. The peasants had leverage. They said, "We will harvest your wheat, but you must pay us double." The Lord was furious, but he had no choice. He paid. Across Europe, wages skyrocketed. The price of labor went up, while the price of land went down. The golden age of the laborer had begun. This terrified the ruling class. The kings and nobles saw their power slipping away. They tried to stop it with laws. In England, King Edward III issued the Statute of Laborers in 1351. This law said, "It is illegal to pay a worker more than they earned before the plague. It is illegal to refuse to work." They tried to freeze the economy in time. They wanted to pretend the plague hadn't happened. But you cannot legislate against reality. The law failed. The market was too strong. Peasants simply walked away to the next town where a different lord would pay them under the table. This was the beginning of the end for serfdom in Western Europe. The rigid hierarchy was cracking. The Pax Mongolica had facilitated the trade that brought the disease, but the disease broke the chains of the feudal system. Think about the irony. The worst humanitarian disaster in history led to the greatest improvement in living standards for the poor. The survivors ate better meat. They wore better clothes. They had more freedom. But while their wallets were full, their souls were empty. But while their wallets were full, their souls were empty. The economic structure had changed, but the spiritual structure was shattering. For centuries, the church had told the people, "If you are good, God will protect you. If you pray, you will be safe." But the plague killed the priests just as fast as the sinners. It killed the monks in their monasteries. It killed the nuns in their convents. The people looked at the empty altars and asked a dangerous question. Why? If the church could not save us, who can? The failure of religious institutions during the plague planted the seeds for the modern world. We are moving from the wallet to the spirit. But while their stomachs were full, their minds were troubled. We are now entering the crisis of faith. This is the moment when the medieval mind began to crack and the modern mind began to form. To understand this, you must understand the role of the church in the 1300s. It was not just a place to pray on Sundays. It was the government of the soul. It held the keys to heaven. It explained everything. Why the sun rose, why the rain fell, and why you suffered. And the church had a clear message. Suffering is a punishment for sin. If you repent, God will show mercy. Then the plague arrived. People rushed to the churches. They prayed. They fasted. They paid for masses to be sung. But the plague did not stop. In fact, the people who prayed the hardest often died the fastest. Why? Because they were gathering in crowded churches, breathing the same air. Even worse, the priests were dying at a staggering rate. English learners, the collective word for religious leaders, is the clergy. The clergy suffered terribly. Why? Because it was their job to visit the sick. They had to perform the last rites, the final prayers for the dying. They walked into the infected rooms. They leaned over the sick to hear their confessions. And so, they caught the disease. In some parts of England and France, nearly 50% of the clergy died. This created a massive problem. The wisest, most experienced priests were gone. They were replaced by rushed, poorly trained, and sometimes illiterate men who just wanted a job. The people noticed the difference. They saw that the institution they trusted was helpless. This led to a powerful feeling called disillusionment. Let's break this word down. An illusion is a false idea or belief. To be disillusioned means to have that false belief stripped away, leaving you with a cold, hard reality. The survivors were disillusioned. They looked at the pile of bodies and thought, the bad people are surviving. The good priests are dying. The logic is broken. If the church could not explain the world, who could? This biological trauma changed art forever. Before the plague, art was often focused on the glory of heaven. After the plague, art became obsessed with the reality of earth. A new artistic theme appeared on church walls across Europe. The danse macabre. This is French for the dance of death. Paintings showed skeletons dancing in a line. They danced with kings, they danced with popes, they danced with peasants. The message was radical and terrifying. Death is the great equalizer. In death, your money does not matter. Your rank does not matter. The paisa, that golden passport we talked about in part 1, does not matter. The bacteria does not care if you are a Khan or a serf. This realization started to shift the focus from the afterlife to the present life. This brings us to the word secular. Religious deals with the divine/gods. Secular deals with the worldly/human. Slowly, very slowly, the European mind became more secular. Doctors began to realize that perhaps prayer wasn't enough. They needed to understand the body. City councils realized they couldn't wait for a miracle. They needed to clean the streets. The Pax Mongolica had connected the world through trade. The plague had connected the world through suffering. And now, that suffering was forcing people to look for answers outside of traditional authority. The unintended consequence of the Mongol peace was not just the death of people, it was the death of blind obedience. The survivors were tougher. They were richer, as we saw in part 6. And now they were more skeptical. They were ready for a new way of thinking. They were ready to stop looking up at the sky for answers and start looking around at the world. But before the rebirth could happen, and the system had to stabilize, the pandemic waves eventually slowed down. The survivors had to rebuild the map. In part 8, we will look at how the geopolitical map changed. The Mongol Empire, which started this whole chain of events, was not immune to its own creation. The peace that built the road was about to be destroyed by the traffic on it. In the previous parts, we watched the plague tear through Europe. We saw the economy flip and the faith crumble. But what about the architects of this disaster? What about the Mongols? In part 1, we marveled at the Pax Mongolica. We saw the virgin with the sack of gold riding safely across the empire. Now, we must witness the irony. English learners, this is one of the most important words in storytelling. Irony. Irony happens when the actual result of a situation is the exact opposite of what you expected. The Mongols built the road to strengthen their empire, but the plague used that road to destroy it. We travel back to the east. The year is the late 1350s. The great Yam system, the postal network we admired, has gone silent. Imagine a Mongol station master waiting on the steppe. He is waiting for the next rider. He is waiting for the caravans carrying silk from China or taxes from Persia. But the horizon is empty. The rider does not come. The caravan does not arrive. Why? Because the merchants are dead. The drivers are dead. The horses are wandering wild. The internet of the Middle Ages has crashed. This caused a catastrophic loss of revenue. Revenue is the income that a government or business collects. For the Mongols, and revenue came from taxing trade. They were the toll collectors of the world. Every time a camel moved a bale of silk, the Khan got a cut. But when the camels stopped moving, the money stopped flowing. Without money, the Khans could not pay their soldiers. Without soldiers, they could not suppress rebellions. The political stability, the Pax, evaporated. In China, the Mongol rulers, the Yuan dynasty, were already struggling. Then the plague hit. It killed millions. The rivers flooded. Famine followed. The Chinese people looked at their Mongol overlords and decided that they had lost the mandate of heaven. Rebellions broke out. This wasn't just a protest. It was a collapse. The Mongol Empire did not just shrink. It underwent fragmentation. Fragmentation means breaking into small, separate, often hostile pieces. In the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Yuan in China, they stopped acting as one unit. They locked their doors against each other. The globalized world shattered into isolated local islands again. The safe passage was gone. The virgin with the sack of gold would now be robbed 5 miles down the road. Here is the lesson on vulnerability. The Mongol Empire was a complex system. A complex system is powerful, but it is fragile. It relies on all the parts working together. If you remove one part, like the population of workers or the safety of the road, the whole machine stops. The Mongols created the perfect conditions for their own downfall. They connected the bacteria to the fuel, and the explosion blew up their own house. By 1368, the Mongol rule in China was over. The Ming dynasty rose, and they rebuilt the Great Wall, not to let people in, but to keep the world out. Globalization went into a coma, but in Europe, the story was different. The Mongol Empire fell into dust, but Europe fell into a fever dream. That would eventually wake up as something new. The plague had acted like a forest fire. A forest fire is terrifying. It burns the trees, it kills the wildlife, it leaves the ground black and scarred. But look closely at the soil after a fire. The ash is nutrient-rich. The canopy is open. Sunlight hits the ground for the first time in centuries. New seeds, which were trapped in the dark, suddenly have room to grow. The Pax Mongolica was the spark. The plague was the fire. And what grew out of the ashes? We call it the Renaissance. In Part 9, we will explore this rebirth. We will see how the survivors, with their new money, their skepticism of the church, and their desperate need to enjoy life, invented the modern world. The darkness is about to break. Now, we stand in the ashes of Europe. The year is 1400. The fire has burned out. The screaming has stopped. And now, we see the green shoots of a new world pushing through the black soil. We are witnessing the birth of the Renaissance. Renaissance is a French word that means rebirth. It refers to the period of explosion in art, science, and culture that followed the Middle Ages. But why did it happen? And why did it happen after the apocalypse? The answer lies in the minds of the survivors. Imagine you survived the plague. You watched half your family die. You watched your neighbors die. You realized that death is random. It strikes the young and the old, the good and the bad, and this trauma created a new psychological state. Before the plague, the mindset was, life is suffering, keep your head down. wait for heaven. After the plague, the mindset became, life is short, it is fragile, we could die tomorrow. So let us do something magnificent today. This is captured in the Latin phrase, carpe diem. Carpe diem means seize the day. The survivors had the money because of the inheritance we discussed in part 6. They had the skepticism because of the church failure we discussed in part 7. And now they had the urgency. They stopped building only for God and started building for humanity. This movement is called humanism. Humanism is a system of thought that focuses on humans and their potential rather than on divine or supernatural matters. Instead of paying a priest to pray for their souls, the wealthy merchants began to pay artists to paint their portraits. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted to leave a legacy. English learners, this is a powerful word. Legacy. A legacy is something you leave behind after you die so that people remember you. It can be money, a building, or a work of art. Because the survivors wanted a legacy on Earth, they poured money into beauty. They hired architects. They hired sculptors. They became patrons. A patron is a wealthy person who supports an artist. Without the plague, there might have been no patrons. The money would have stayed locked up in old land or given to the church. The plague unlocked the vaults. But the rebirth wasn't just about art. It was about innovation. Innovation means creating new methods, ideas, or products. Remember the labor shortage? There were not enough workers to do the hard jobs. English proverb time. Necessity is the mother of invention. Because they lacked workers, they had to invent machines to do the work. They improved water mills. They improved mining technology. They started looking for ways to print books faster because the scribes were dead. The pressure of the collapse forced the system to upgrade. The Pax Mongolica had ended, but its ghost was still present. The silk, the paper, and the gunpowder that had traveled the Mongol roads were now in European hands. But now, Europe had a new, desperate energy to use them. The biological shock of the plague had broken the old, rigid habits of the medieval world. It shattered the glass ceiling of feudalism. It was a terrible price to pay. Millions died in agony. We cannot forget that. But history is often a story of unintended consequences. The Mongols wanted an empire of tax-paying subjects. They got a pandemic. The bacteria wanted to replicate. It got a global transport system. Europeans wanted to survive. They got a cultural revolution. We are now approaching the end of our journey. We have traveled from the steppes of Mongolia to the ports of Sicily, through the graveyards of France, and into the art studios of Italy. We have seen how a political peace caused a biological war. In part 10, we will zoom out one last time. We will summarize the English vocabulary we have learned, and we will ask the final question: could this happen again? We live in a world that looks very similar to the Pax Mongolica. We have fast travel. We have global trade. We have a connected economy. Are we safer than they were? Or are we just waiting for the next rider to arrive? We have traveled thousands of miles across the steppes of Asia. We have sailed across the Black Sea. We have walked through the silent streets of Europe. And we have seen the artistic explosion of the Renaissance. We started with a golden tablet, the Paisa, and we ended with a painting of a dancing skeleton. Now, we must ask the final question. What does this story mean for us today? It is easy to look at the people of the 14th century and think they were primitive. They didn't know what a bacterium was. They thought bad air caused disease. But in many ways, they were exactly like us. They lived in a world of globalization. English learners, this is a word you hear often. Globalization. Globalization is the process by which businesses, cultures, and economies develop international influence or start operating on an international scale. The Mongols were the first true globalizers. They lowered the borders. They made trade easy. They made travel fast. Does that sound familiar? Today, we do not use horses. We use airplanes. We do not use the Yam postal stations. We use the internet. But the principle is the same. We have built a world designed for speed and connection. And just like the Pax Mongolica, our modern peace comes with a hidden price tag. This brings us to the concept of the paradox. A paradox is a situation that seems impossible because it contains two opposite facts that are both true. Here is the paradox of connection. The systems that make us rich are the same systems that make us vulnerable. The efficiency of the supply chain allows you to buy a phone made in China while sitting in London. But that same efficiency allows a virus to travel from a remote forest to a major city in less than 24 hours. We are interdependent. Interdependent means that two or more things rely on each other. The peasant in 1348 relied on the Mongol peace, even if he didn't know it. When the peace broke, his world broke. So, what is the lesson? Should we be afraid? Should we close the borders and hide in our castles? History suggests the answer is no. Remember what happened after the fire. Remember the green shoots. The lesson of the plague is not just about death. It is about resilience. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. Toughness. Human beings are incredibly resilient. When the system collapsed, the survivors didn't just give up. They invented new machines. They created new art. They renegotiated their value as workers. The tragedy of the Pax Mongolica teaches us to respect the invisible forces of nature. It teaches us that political stability is fragile. But it also teaches us that the end of the world is rarely the end of the story. As you continue learning English, try to look at history not just as a list of dates, but as a chain of cause and effect. Look for the catalysts, the triggers, like the Mongol peace. Look for the vectors, the carriers, like the fleas. Look for the outcomes, the results, like the Renaissance. When you can describe these connections, your English will move from simple sentences to complex, powerful storytelling. The Silk Road is gone now. The Mongol Empire is dust. But the lesson remains. We are all connected. We are all riding on the same road. And we are all responsible for what we carry with us. Thank you for traveling with us on this journey through the London Gritty Chronicles. Keep reading, keep watching, and keep learning. I'm your host. History is gritty, but the future is yours to write.